Consider if Donald Trump already possessed concrete intelligence, rather than mere whispers or theories that rested within Jeffrey Epstein's private archives prior to his demise. Because the subsequent inquiry Senator Murray directed at Pam Bondi extended far beyond a simple fatality to address exactly what remained unexamined and the reasons behind that oversight, while the official testifying under oath before Senator Murray bore the responsibility for resolving every last one of those inquiries. Yet she failed to do so, guaranteeing that her silence would finally become a matter of public record today. We must question if an authentic probe ever occurred or if the involved parties already understood the outcome, and within a mere 83 seconds the entire narrative began to unravel, compelling us to analyze each passing moment because this situation transcended basic administrative errors or bureaucratic ineptitude, as the specifics of the events and the deliberately ignored elements form a framework so precise and intentional that Senator Murray arrived at the hearing equipped not with mere hunches, but with an exhaustive, cross-referenced, and thoroughly sourced chronology that federal prosecutors had spent years desperately hoping would never be compiled. She successfully put it all together. Senator Murray walked into the chamber without making a sound, avoiding any theatrical displays or dramatic tension, carrying only a leather binder, a standard legal notepad, and the distinct quiet confidence of a seasoned prosecutor who has already secured victory before posing a single inquiry. Pam Bondi sat on the opposite side, appearing entirely poised, well-prepared, and self-assured, radiating the exact type of confidence displayed by individuals who falsely assume their defensive perimeters remain entirely intact. Those defenses had already crumbled. Addressing the Attorney General, Murray commenced with a deep, measured tone characteristic of someone establishing a solid groundwork, stating she wished to begin with the straightforward matter of the 48 hours preceding the demise, focusing specifically on his communications to determine exactly who he conversed with, demanding specific names, call logs, and recipients rather than vague summaries. She asked if those official records were thoroughly secured and analyzed by the department, continuing without pausing for a response by noting that internal registries indicated numerous outgoing messages during his concluding days, with several linked to figures within his monetary enterprise and others remaining entirely unaddressed in the public sphere. She questioned whether those communications were provided to the investigative team, citing internal overviews analyzed by various media and organizations that showed at least one of those last phone calls lacked complete clarification regarding the initiator and the subject matter, leaving a glaring hole in a purportedly flawless chronology. And when chronologies exhibit such holes, diligent detectives typically demand explanations unless the discrepancies were intentionally buried. When the witness attempted to state that communications of that specific nature would fall under standard protocols, Murray abruptly interjected to demand under what authority, reminding her that the individual remained in federal custody where every single call was officially tracked, and directly demanded a simple affirmative or negative regarding whether those specific logs underwent review. The witness clenched her jaw noticeably. After Bondi claimed to have received briefings aligning with his final contacts, Murray dismissed the evasive reply with the calm dominance of an interrogator weary of deflections, demanding to know if those individuals were interrogated or publicly named, emphasizing that the American public remains entirely ignorant regarding who Jeffrey Epstein conversed with during his last hours, and she demanded an explanation for that secrecy. Absolutely no response materialized, yet the senator was far from concluding her inquiry. She simply flipped to the next page of her notes. She proposed shifting the discussion to the financial aspects, declaring that this specific area marks the transition from apparent carelessness to something fundamentally more sinister. Locking eyes with Bondi, she stated that massive monetary transfers were launched in the days immediately prior to his passing, clarifying these were not standard banking maintenance procedures, but rather transactions of a magnitude and character that would instantaneously prompt formal audits and documentation under standard regulatory guidelines, especially since they linked to figures named in confidential estate records. She took a brief pause before asking if those specific financial movements were flagged, if they underwent scrutiny, and if the department inquired about the identity of the person initiating them and the reasoning behind their execution at that precise juncture. As Bondi prepared to speak, Murray swiftly pressed forward, noting that over $1 billion flowed through banking channels tied to the estate in the weeks subsequent to his passing, reiterating the staggering billion-dollar sum while highlighting the complete absence of congressional inquiries, the lack of urgency, and the prevailing silence that absolutely no one in the chamber could justify. Highlighting the lack of formal inquiries, the absence of pressing action, and the overwhelming quiet, she raised her gaze and simply asked why. The entire chamber remained frozen, and this is the exact moment requiring utmost attention, because Murray's subsequent statement abandoned topics of finances, protocols, or supervisory breakdowns to broach a significantly more sinister subject, posing the exact type of inquiry that permanently alters the landscape the moment it is vocalized. Lowering her vocal pitch just a fraction, Murray addressed the Attorney General to inquire about the physical conditions present that evening, noting that impartial specialists and pathologists hired by relatives rather than federal authorities had raised grave concerns regarding the events inside that holding area, presenting discrepancies that contradict the authorized findings and would typically necessitate a compulsory secondary examination in any standard scenario. She hesitated briefly to ask if the department had ordered an impartial forensic evaluation, specifically one executed entirely separate from the bureaucratic hierarchy that was already compromised by the supervisory breakdowns of that fateful night. Following a brief moment of tension, Bondi softly replied in the negative. Murray echoed the negative response, lacking any overt disdain but utilizing a softer, far more destructive inflection, mimicking the cadence of an individual securing a permanent truth for the historical archives. The surveillance equipment inside the cell block was entirely non-functional, and beyond the immediate cameras failing, detectives subsequently verified that recordings from adjacent sectors designed to monitor hallway traffic were similarly inaccessible, not merely corrupted or fragmented, but completely vanished. And seasoned investigators rarely attribute concurrent catastrophic failures across multiple systems to mere happenstance. The security personnel assigned to the shift neglected to perform their compulsory inspections while actively falsifying the official logs to indicate the rounds had been finalized. The roommate who was scheduled to be present had been relocated shortly prior, which is highly suspect considering a severe altercation had recently occurred within the identical facility mere weeks earlier, an event that fundamentally should have mandated elevated vigilance, rigorous surveillance, and unyielding supervision. Rather than tightening security, safety measures were diminished, leaving the single individual demanding the absolute maximum degree of observation exposed to the weakest tier of safeguarding, while the forensic discrepancies highlighted by external specialists never received clarification through a secondary impartial autopsy. She allowed the gravity of that timeline to linger in the atmosphere before asking if such a framework alarmed the Attorney General, subsequently offering to rephrase the inquiry by bluntly asking if she genuinely accepted the authorized narrative of his passing, or if the final verdict had been drafted before any actual detective work commenced. As Bondi attempted to claim that appropriate evaluations were executed by the relevant authorities, Murray cut in to demand the identity of the individual who approved the relocation, and the specific official who mandated the detainee remain entirely isolated in his quarters during that specific night. An expanding silence permeated the chamber, completely enveloping the space, prompting Murray to assert that a specific individual actively made that choice, and it certainly did not unfold by mere chance. An official wielding the power to relocate a federal prisoner actively elected to transfer him, an operative possessing clearance for the building's infrastructure was on site when the surveillance feeds failed, and an unidentified person within the supervisory hierarchy executed a sequence of choices that might seem harmless if viewed in isolation, indicating that the responsible party possessed immense leverage to penetrate a federal penitentiary and systematically erase standard operating procedures. Entry into that specific sector was strictly controlled, demanding that every single admission undergo authorization, tracking, and verification, signifying that if an unauthorized individual gained entry, the corresponding documentation either remains hidden or was intentionally destroyed, with both scenarios prompting the exact same alarming inquiry. She paused before adding that when examined collectively, these elements construct a scenario that no dedicated detective would ever simply abandon. The atmosphere within the chamber grew inexplicably more hushed as she advanced to the subsequent page of her materials. A handful of journalists raised their heads as she declared her intention to discuss Mark Epstein. She pointed out that the department had acquired the statements belonging to the disgraced financier's brother, challenging Bondi to confirm whether she had personally analyzed his exact testimony rather than a mere condensed overview. Displaying slight hesitation, Bondi claimed she had reviewed the relevant documents. Murray stated that the brother explicitly expressed profound disbelief that the fatality transpired in accordance with the official government narrative. He communicated unequivocally that a random occurrence would absolutely not necessitate a massive concealment effort, quoting his exact phrasing, before she noted he revealed an additional crucial detail. Glancing at her notes, she relayed his claim that during 2016, his sibling confided that disclosing his knowledge regarding specific political contenders would force the nullification of the entire electoral contest, underscoring the massive consequence of the intelligence he hoarded. She placed her documents flat on the desk, emphasizing that Donald Trump represented one of those precise contenders, shifting the central dilemma from what the financier knew to the identities of the other powerful figures who shared that dangerous awareness. The brother verified that the two men maintained an exceptionally tight bond, utilizing his specific terminology, and he delivered this confirmation openly for the public record. Locking eyes with Bondi, Murray asked if the agency ever conducted a formal evaluation to determine if the dossiers held by the deceased or the figures identified inside them overlapped with vital political agendas surrounding the time of his demise, pressing to know if any official possessing the jurisdiction and courage ever chased that inquiry to its ultimate conclusion. 12 seconds evaporated, stretching into 20, and eventually 35, while a legislative assistant standing near the rear partition gradually folded her arms as the media section fell into absolute silence, devoid of keyboard clicks, rustling papers, or any trace of background sound. Exactly 50 seconds elapsed. Bondi eventually broke the silence, her vocal tone navigating a precarious boundary between maintaining poise and completely unraveling, asserting her belief that all suitable measures were executed within the judicial and administrative structures accessible during that period. Murray offered a single deliberate nod, perfectly reflecting the demeanor of an individual who fully anticipated that exact deflection and had already formulated a countermeasure. Echoing the phrase regarding the available framework, she proposed phrasing the inquiry differently, pointing out that every single guard and duty officer present inside the building that evening provided formal testimonies and underwent thorough interrogations. Staring straight at Bondi, she demanded to know exactly how many of those employees faced authentic repercussions for the events that unfolded under their supervision, specifically regarding the verified breakdowns, the skipped patrols, the fabricated records, and the broken hardware, pressing to discover how many encountered punitive measures commensurate with the severity of the disaster they permitted. When no reply surfaced, Murray stated that based on her comprehensive review of the materials, the bureaucracy successfully cataloged the catastrophe, meticulously documenting every neglected patrol, registering the surveillance blackout, and officially recognizing the operational breaches. Taking a calculated pause, she concluded that the department then handled those catastrophic errors as mere bureaucratic infractions rather than recognizing them as the possible enablement of a permanent and irreversible tragedy. Shutting her binder completely, she asked the Attorney General if she could comprehend why the American public struggles immensely to swallow that narrative. Bondi's facial expression shifted into an entirely inscrutable mask, prompting Murray to finally deliver the pivotal question the entire proceeding had been accelerating toward, asking it softly and devoid of drama, employing the specific cadence used when the answer is already suspected, but the subject is granted one ultimate chance to embrace honesty. She addressed the Attorney General to ask whether she genuinely believed the demise of Jeffrey Epstein received a comprehensive and impartial probe, pushing her to declare if she thought every necessary inquiry was posed, every single clue was chased down, and every individual possessing pertinent information was isolated and brought to justice. She paused briefly before asking if the witness instead suspected that certain elements surrounding that fateful evening were deliberately designed to remain forever shrouded in mystery. A staggering 83 seconds of total silence followed. completely recorded by 3 separate broadcasting lenses. Upon finally speaking, Bondi provided a highly calculated, bureaucratically engineered, and seemingly impenetrable response, perfectly mirroring the defensive rhetoric employed by individuals who have dedicated years to constructing barricades protecting a specific secret. However, absolutely no one in the chamber paid attention to her words, as they remained captivated by the preceding silence, reflecting on how the surveillance broke, the sentry slumbered, the roommate disappeared, the massive funds shifted, the phone records vanished from scrutiny, the autopsy anomalies lingered, and the sibling explicitly alleged a massive concealment effort. The discussion dating back to 2016 indicated a scandal vastly eclipsing the offenses of a solitary individual, while the official tasked with securing resolutions squandered 83 seconds, proving entirely incapable of offering one, demonstrating that eventually this scenario sheds the appearance of incompetence and adopts a far more sinister facade because absolutely no bureaucratic excuse can justify a situation where immense resources, supreme jurisdiction, and a moral duty to uncover reality yield zero results, shifting the debate from whether the infrastructure malfunctioned to whether it executed its intended design flawlessly. Therefore, we must practice total honesty and question what you genuinely suspect transpired within those concrete walls during that specific evening. At this current juncture, the government's authorized narrative is not merely facing skepticism, it is undergoing meticulous dissection, fragment by fragment and element by element, and whenever authorities attempt to seal the inquiry, a fresh discrepancy violently wedges it back ajar. Contemplate the exact chronological progression, ignoring the media banners and condensed overviews to focus on the authentic timeline, where an exceptionally prominent federal prisoner holding intelligence, potent enough to ensnare sprawling webs of influence spanning the financial sector, political arenas, and international power brokers is deposited into a penitentiary that previously demonstrated an inability to protect him. The optical sensors completely shut down, the watchmen abandon their patrols, the official registries suffer fabrication, the bunkmate is relocated, standard security measures are dangerously loosened, and inexplicably, every individual defensive barrier designed explicitly to thwart this precise catastrophe collapses simultaneously, with not a single supervisory official capable of explaining how every solitary precaution malfunctioned in such impeccable unison. Operational infrastructures do not crumble in that specific manner. Rather, they are intentionally circumvented, and anyone willing to dismiss this as mere synchronicity must simultaneously embrace a degree of bureaucratic stupidity so severe that it stretches the boundaries of logical possibility. The fundamental issue remains that when bureaucratic machines malfunction unintentionally, they typically overcompensate by launching aggressive internal audits and broadcasting their vulnerabilities in a desperate bid to salvage public faith, yet that restorative action remains completely absent from this scenario. The actual outcome here manifested as pure silence, a meticulously controlled, judicially engineered, and administratively shielded silence. The specific variety of quietness that requires active maintenance rather than passive occurrence, prompting a fundamentally different inquiry that extends far beyond the deceased financier, his holding area, or that specific evening, compelling us to ask who exactly reaps the rewards of that secrecy. Secrecy operating at such an elevated tier is never an impartial force, as it invariably shields a specific entity or individual, a reality Senator Murray thoroughly grasped, explaining why her interrogation bypassed the visible events to probe the specific topics that were strictly forbidden from being discussed. She remained entirely uninterested in pursuing a simple error, opting instead to map an invisible perimeter, identifying the precise threshold that federal detectives refuse to breach, revealing a boundary that becomes permanently etched into your awareness the moment you finally perceive it. Re-examine the massive banking transfers, scrutinize the phone logs that suffered suppression, observe the identities locked behind court seals, and analyze the lack of a secondary autopsy despite external specialists directly challenging the government's conclusions, recognizing that while isolated anomalies might offer innocent explanations, their combined weight constructs an undeniable architecture of intentional evasion rather than accidental failure, representing a deliberate framework that requires active construction, constant upkeep, and fierce protection. This ultimately circles back to the devastating inquiry that hung suspended within the chamber for 83 seconds, remaining unaddressed not due to a lack of an explanation, but because offering any truthful response would unleash catastrophic repercussions that refused to remain localized within a congressional committee, instead sending destructive shockwaves ripping through sprawling agencies, prestigious legacies, and entrenched hierarchies of power, suggesting that containing the damage was always the primary objective. Perhaps the true ambition never involved uncovering reality, but rather manipulating it, suppressing it, and keeping the facts perpetually inaccessible by burying them beneath bureaucratic red tape, stalling through administrative maneuvers, and allowing the passage of time to weaken the impact. Understanding perfectly that time naturally diminishes public fury, obscures vital specifics, and transforms piercing interrogations into fading whispers. Nevertheless, occasionally an individual strides into an arena armed with a flawless chronological record, irrefutable documentation, and the exact precision required to rebuild a narrative that the establishment desperately wished to keep shattered, causing the protective wall of silence to briefly yet undeniably fracture. The spectacle witnessed during those 83 seconds showcased pure, crushing pressure rather than simple bewilderment or reluctance, demonstrating the immense strain an infrastructure endures when pushed to the absolute limit of its fabricated narrative without exposing its hidden truths. An agonizing burden Bondi visibly suffered, evident in her prolonged silences and evasive maneuvers, utilizing rhetoric engineered exclusively to withstand interrogation rather than provide illumination. During such precarious instances, the paramount objective shifts from achieving transparency to maintaining quarantine, yet quarantine strictly depends upon the public ceasing their relentless questioning, representing the solitary factor that no sprawling bureaucracy can completely dominate. Once skepticism breaches that upper echelon, it propagates stealthily before erupting simultaneously across the populace, prompting citizens to link disparate details, reevaluate basic premises, and scrutinize identical evidence from entirely new perspectives, abruptly rendering the government's narrative highly unstable and entirely reliant upon a willingness to overlook glaring contradictions. This specific realization elevates the scandal far beyond a single legal proceeding or a solitary individual, demonstrating that if an administrative framework can collapse this thoroughly, this publicly, and with such catastrophic results while completely avoiding genuine punitive action, the true problem lies entirely within the malicious architecture of the system itself. A structural hierarchy capable of absorbing such a massive shockwave without disintegrating is heavily fortified rather than delicate, utilizing its formidable insulation to shield its internal components, shifting the paramount inquiry away from the deceased financier to focus instead on the dark nature the bureaucracy inadvertently exposed, revealing exactly how authority functions while under siege, prioritizing its own survival while ruthlessly leaving critical inquiries dangling in the void. Ultimately, tangible evidence refuses to vanish, official registries do not spontaneously wipe themselves clean, and vital interrogations retain their immense gravity regardless of the advancing calendar, simply lying dormant until a courageous individual dares to resurrect them during the next inevitable pressure cooker scenario, generating another agonizing 83 seconds where silence communicates far more than verbal responses ever could. When that critical juncture inevitably materializes once more, the sole determining factor will be whether an individual possesses the fortitude to shatter the quietness, or if the establishment successfully repeats its historical performance by reinforcing its barricades, securing its own survival, and keeping reality perpetually obscured. That remains the horrifying truth that few dare to vocalize publicly, knowing that the moment you concede the terrifying possibility that the catastrophe was a highly orchestrated maneuver rather than a spontaneous collapse, you completely forfeit the ability to retreat back into the comforting embrace of the sanitized narrative. You permanently lose the capacity to ignore the glaring blueprint or feign blindness to the massive discrepancies. As every vanished fragment increasingly reeks of premeditation and every unresolved mystery appears fiercely guarded, making it progressively more impossible to accept the premise that everyone remained completely ignorant, totally blind, and entirely powerless to intervene. Machineries of this magnitude do not operate upon a foundation of ignorance. They thrive on vast, deeply ingrained awareness categorized into highly regulated, strategically isolated compartments that guarantee constant surveillance, ensuring that specific individuals situated along the operational ladder grasp the exact nature of the unfolding events. Specific personnel comprehended the hazards, recognized the massive fallout, and calculated the devastating exposures that would result if the scenario shifted course, yet possessing that critical intelligence failed to spark any heroic intervention or demand for transparency. Instead, it actively commanded a suffocating silence that preemptively enveloped the tragedy, continually reinforcing its borders to guarantee the truth remained perpetually undecipherable. This agonizing ordeal retains its immense significance not merely due to its lack of a satisfying conclusion, but explicitly because of the highly suspicious manner in which it was abandoned, serving as a chilling testament to the severe restrictions placed upon justice the moment supreme authority enters the equation. Analyze the sheer volume of critical junctures spanning that chronology where a minor deviation could have radically altered the finale, requiring only a single sentry completing a patrol, one operational lens, a solitary manager demanding compliance, or one detective pressing marginally harder, proving that averting the disaster required merely a single fractured link rather than a complete systemic reconstruction. However, absolutely zero fractures occurred, as every individual component performed flawlessly to facilitate the tragedy at the precise moment required, presenting a terrifying synchronization that transcends mere skepticism to mandate an immediate and uncompromising reckoning.